Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a question that has, well, quite literally shaped civilizations. And it still echoes today.
Which question is that?
Is human nature fundamentally good? Or is it, maybe, fundamentally not so good? It's a huge one.
Ah, yes. The big one. It's a debate that, goes way beyond just philosophy books.
Totally. It influences everything, right?
Yeah.
Laws, education, how we raise kids, even politics. Like, do we trust people or do they need strict rules?
Exactly. These aren't just abstract thoughts. They're incredibly practical questions we grapple with all the time, sometimes without even realizing it.
And it's fascinating how different traditions tackle it.
It really is. In the West, you often have these ideas, original sin, maybe inherent flaws, a sort of difficult starting point for humanity.
Right.
But in the East, and especially in Confucianism, this is the exact same question. It sparked, a massive intellectual firestorm, a real split that troubled thinkers for centuries.
A firestorm. I like that. And it wasn't just a quick flare-up, was it? It simmered for ages within Confucianism itself.
Oh, for centuries.
Specifically around these two major figures who came after Confucius.
Mencius and Shunts.
Right. Mencius, he's the one who famously argued that human nature is originally good, filled with these little sprouts of virtue just waiting to grow.
That's his core idea, yes. Innate goodness.
And then you have Sun Tzu. And he took a much, I guess you could say, grimmer view, or maybe more pragmatic.
Definitely more pragmatic, maybe even pessimistic, depending on your view. He suggested human nature actually tends towards, evil, unless it's trained, rigorously trained, through education, through ritual.
Wow, so like a philosophical family feud almost.
You could say that.
But not just about ideas, right? It was about how you actually build a society, how you raise people.
Precisely. And this wasn't some obscure scholarly debate either. It became a really critical point of division. And it all sort of came to a head in the 12th century with Chu.
Chu. He's a huge name in Neo-Confucianism, isn't he?
Immensely influential.
Oh.
His interpretations basically became the standard, the canon. And as part of his big effort to solidify what he saw as Confucian orthodoxy,
he made a call on this debate.
He did. He explicitly declared Sun Tzu's view on human nature to be unorthodox. Wrong.
Whoa. So he officially took sides.
Big time. And that wasn't just, a minor comment. It had enormous consequences. It basically pushed Sun Tzu and his ideas to the margins of mainstream Confucianism for hundreds of years. It shaped how everyone after him learned and practiced Confucianism.
Okay. So our mission today, for you listening, is to kind of unravel this mystery, this deep historical, philosophical puzzle.
Right.
We're going to look at some really pivotal research that challenges those long-held ideas about who was right or orthodox.
We're going back to the source.
Exactly. Straight to the foundation. What did Confucius himself, the guy who started it all, actually say about human nature? Or, maybe more importantly, what didn't he say? Can we actually figure out who was orthodox based on the original texts? Was it really as clear as Chu made it out to be centuries later?
And to help us navigate this really fascinating landscape, we're going to be relying pretty heavily on a key piece of scholarship. It's an article called Nature in the Teaching of Confucius by Homer H. Dubbs.
Homer H. Dubbs. And when was this written?
It was published way back in 1930, actually, in the Journal of the American Oriental Society.
Wow, 1930. So nearly a century ago.
Yeah, but it's a fantastic example of how really close, careful reading of the original texts, stripping away all the layers of later interpretation can totally flip our understanding.
Right. It forces you to question the standard story and go back to the actual words.
Precisely. It makes us confront our assumptions.
Okay, let's unpack this core idea then, this agitating question, as the source calls it, good versus evil in human nature.
It really was agitating. Because as you said, it's not just abstract, it touches everything.
Yeah, how do you set up society? If people are basically good, maybe you need less government, less control, a more laissez-faire approach.
Maybe. Or at least a different kind of guidance. Nurturing, perhaps?
But if people tend towards selfishness or disorder, well, then you need strict rules, right? Strong education, strong leaders become totally essential.
It makes a world of difference. How leaders govern, how kids are taught, what's expected of citizens. It all stems from that basic assumption about human nature.
So right after Confucius, his followers agreed on revering him, but not on this.
They revered the master, absolutely, but they diverged sharply, almost immediately, on this fundamental point about human potential. You had Mencius.
The good nature guy, Probably the most famous interpreter.
Arguably, yes. He really championed that idea, innate goodness. Those sprouts or beginnings of virtue. Compassion, righteousness, propriety, wisdom. He believed they were inside everyone, just needed nurturing.
So for Mencius, becoming a good person was about developing what's already pure inside you.
That's the core of it, unfolding your innate potential.
And then Sun Tzu.
He painted a very different picture, starkly different.
He argued human nature is evil. Is that the right word?
Well, the translation is often evil, but maybe a better way to think about it is that it tends towards evil or maybe towards selfishness and disorder unless it's actively shaped and trained.
Through education, ritual, sticking to the rules.
Exactly, through all those external structures and disciplines. For Sun Tzu, our natural inclinations, if you just let them run wild, lead to chaos and conflict. So that external guidance, that hard work of self-discipline, it wasn't just helpful, it was absolutely necessary, indispensable.
A much more, demanding view of becoming good.
Definitely. Less about inherent goodness, more about acquired goodness through effort and structure.
And this tug-of-war, as you said, leads eventually to 2C.
Right. The great synthesizer, the systematizer of Neo-Confucianism in the 12th century, a period of intense intellectual activity.
And he's the one who sort of refereed this match, declared a winner.
In effect, yes. He decisively ruled Sun Tzu's view on human nature as unorthodox, outside the accepted tradition.
And that decision stuck.
It stuck hard. It carried immense weight. It wasn't just his opinion. It shaped the official imperial examinations, the educational curriculum. It essentially sidelined Sun Tzu's specific views on this for centuries within the mainstream, made Mencius the official interpretation on this point.
Which brings us right back to our main question, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because if we could just find out what Confucius himself actually said, if there was a clear statement from the master on whether nature is good or bad.
Then, as Doves points out in the source, it would settle the whole thing. It would determine the orthodoxy of these two Confucians without any difficulty.
Game over. We'd know who was really following Confucius's original idea.
It would be the ultimate proof.
But the fact that this debate raged for so long, and that Chusea had to make such a definitive ruling centuries later, it kind of suggests Confucius wasn't so clear, doesn't it?
That's precisely what makes this whole investigation so interesting. The apparent silence, or at least the ambiguity, from the founder himself on such a crucial point. How could it stay unresolved?
It really is compelling. And what's wild is how, even much later, people were still arguing about it, and some were really sure Confucius had been clear.
Oh, absolutely. Even in the 20th century, when Doves was writing, our source mentions some modern scholars who were quite confident Confucius did take a stand, that he did say human nature is good.
Like who?
Well, there was a reviewer of Doves' earlier book on Sun Tzu who just flat out stated Confucius said nature is good, even tried quoting the Analects to prove it.
Okay. Hey, wasn't there another one? Dr. Creel?
Yes, Dr. H.G. Creel, another scholar. He claimed Confucius taught that all things, including human nature, are good, and it was only by perversion that they became evil.
Wow, that's pretty direct. All things good.
Very direct. And think about the implications if Creel is right.
Yeah, if he's right, then Mencius is clearly the true heir, orthodox.
Totally.
In Sun Tzu. Well, in Creel's words, he becomes the destroyer of the principles of Confucius. Pretty harsh.
Extremely harsh. But it hinges entirely on whether Creel's claim about Confucius is actually supported by the texts.
Which brings us back to the evidence.
Yeah.
What do the Analects, the primary source, actually say? Are these claims solid?
That's the million-dollar question. And here's something significant. Despite these strong claims by Creel and others, our source points out something telling.
What's that?
That most writers on ancient Chinese philosophy do not mention Confucius's attitude on whether human nature is specifically good or bad. There's a kind of silence in a lot of the scholarship preceding these confident assertions.
So it wasn't a major point of discussion about Confucius for many scholars.
Apparently not on this specific point of inherent goodness or badness. Now, Dr. Cheng, who wrote about Sun Tzu's theory, did note a view from before Confucius's time.
Okay.
The idea was that human nature was seen as a moral endowment of heaven, and heaven, in that worldview, was definitely considered good, the source of moral order.
Okay, wait. If heaven is good, and human nature comes from heaven, doesn't that automatically mean human nature is good? It seems like simple logic. A equals B, B equals C, so A is C.
It certainly feels like it should, doesn't it? That seems like the obvious conclusion to draw.
Yeah.
But here's the really crucial point Doves makes, drawing on Cheng. It's subtle but vital. While those early thinkers saw nature as an endowment from a good heaven, the conclusion that human nature itself is inherently good, that step wasn't explicitly made in the documents we have from before Confucius.
So they didn't actually say it out loud, basically.
Exactly. It highlights this huge problem in looking back at history and philosophy, the danger of reading our own logic or later debates back into earlier texts, of assuming a connection that the original writers didn't explicitly state themselves.
They had the ingredients, maybe,
Yeah.
but didn't bake that specific cake.
That's a great way to put it. The philosophical problem of whether human nature in itself is good or bad hadn't quite crystallized as a specific point of debate in the earlier texts. It might have been an assumption, but it wasn't a stated doctrine.
Okay, so inference isn't enough. We need explicit proof from Confucius.
Precisely. If we want to solve this, we have to go to the main source, the Analects. That's where we'd find the justification, if it exists, not in later interpretations, no matter how famous the interpreter.
And when we do that, when we actually look closely at the Analects for Confucius's views on this,
what's really striking is how little there is. It's quite amazing, actually, especially given how certain people like Creel sounded.
how little?
Dubs states very clearly, only 2 passages from the Analects have ever really been used to argue. Confucius weighed in on whether human nature is good or bad. Just 2.
Only 2 passages in the whole collection.
That's what the scholarship indicates. And Creel, remember, he claimed nothing could be more explicit than these 2 statements.
Okay, explicit. Let's see if they really are. This is where the deep dive really starts.
Let's dig in. The first one is Analects 7:32.
Got it. What does it say?
The translation usually goes something like, by nature, men are nearly alike. By practice, they come to be wide apart.
By nature, nearly alike. By practice, wide apart. Okay. On the surface, that seems fairly clear.
It does seem straightforward, and if you look at someone like James Legge, the famous translator,
Yeah.
his note on this passage, Dubs, says, correctly summarizes this saying as asserting, the differences in the characters of men are chiefly owing to habit. Which sounds right. We start similar, experiences make us different.
Okay. But there's a but coming, isn't there?
There's a big but, according to Dubs' analysis. While Legge's summary about habit-causing differences might be fair, the passage itself merely states that men are originally equal, or nearly alike.
It just says we start out similar.
Exactly. It points to a shared starting point, maybe like a blank slate, or at least undifferentiated potential. But, and this is the key, it makes no judgment of like the quality of that starting nature.
It doesn't say if alike means alike in goodness, or alike in badness, or alike in neutralness.
Precisely. It just says alike. It doesn't assign a moral value, good or bad, to that original state. And what's really fascinating here, if you think about it, because it's so open-ended, this passage could actually be used to support Sunsa.
How so? Sunsa, the bad nature guy.
Well, think about it. If we start alike, but it's practice and habit that makes some people good and others not.
Then maybe the starting point isn't inherently good. Maybe it needs that practice to become good.
Exactly. It could imply that without the right practice, the default isn't goodness. It fits perfectly with Sunsa's idea that external training is what cultivates virtue. So the passage fundamentally says nothing about the nature of original human nature in terms of good or bad. It just notes we start similar and change through experience.
Wow. Okay. So passage number 1 isn't the smoking gun for good nature after all. Not explicit.
Far from it. It's ambiguous at best on that specific point.
Right. More about how we change than what we start as, morally speaking. Okay, 1 down. What's the second passage? The other supposedly crucial one.
This is Analects 6:17. This is the one often seen as the strongest evidence, the one Dr. Cheng also cited.
And Legge's translation, the one Creel used, what does that say?
Legge translates it as, man is born for uprightness. If a man lose his uprightness and yet live, his escape from death is the effect of mere good fortune.
Man is born for uprightness. Okay, that sounds pretty definitive. Born for it. Seems to clearly support the good nature side, Mencius's side.
It absolutely does on the surface, and for centuries, this translation really cemented the idea that Confucius backed Mencius. Case closed, right?
Seems like it.
But this is where Dubs brings in the heavy artillery of philology, the close study of the original language.
Okay, linguistics time. What's the issue?
The issue is that a careful examination of the original text and of the Chinese commentaries shows that Legge and his translation has followed the interpretation of Chus.
Chus again, the 12th century guy who declared Sun Tzu unorthodox.
The very same, and this is critical, because Chu, who was actively trying to establish Mencius's view as the correct one, well, he'd naturally be inclined to read Confucius in a way that supported Mencius, wouldn't he?
Yeah, that makes sense. He'd want Confucius to agree with the orthodoxy he was building. It's confirmation bias, almost. Looking for evidence that fits your theory.
Whether conscious or unconscious, his own philosophical project would inevitably shape how he read the earlier texts. It's a common pitfall in interpretation.
Okay, so Legge followed Chu's possibly biased reading. But what's this specific linguistic problem Dubs found with Chu's interpretation?
It comes down to one character. Z.
Z.
What does that mean? Well, that's part of the issue. In classical Chinese, Z can mean several things depending on context. It can mean straight, upright, direct, but it can also relate to life or to live.
Okay.
Now, the problem is this passage has two parallel phrases, and Chu's interpretation forces him to give the character Z two radically different meanings in two precisely parallel phrases.
Wait, you can't do that.
Not really, no. Not if you want to respect the structure of the language. Think about classical Chinese or even just good rhetorical style in English. There's a fundamental rule. The same character in the same position in parallel clauses must be taken with the same meaning, otherwise the parallelism of the clauses is defeated. It ruins the balance, the intended connection.
Can you give an analogy? Make it clear.
Sure. Imagine a saying like, to err is human, to forgive, divine. The structure is parallel. Now imagine someone argued that in the first part, to err means to make a mistake, but in the second part, to forgive actually means to forget. It breaks the parallel meaning structure.
Ah, I see. So Xi appears in both parts of Confucius' saying.
Yes, in parallel positions. Chu interprets the first Xi in Man is Born for Z as uprightness, linking it to innate nature at birth. But then in the second part, if a man lose his Z, that meaning doesn't quite fit the context of escaping death. So Chu has to basically make Z mean something closer to life or the normal course of life there. Two different meanings for the same word in the same structural position.
Which breaks the rule. It forces the text to fit his theory.
Precisely. It's linguistically inconsistent.
So if we follow the rule and find a meaning for Z that works consistently in both parallel clauses, what happens? What meaning works?
Dubs argues that the meaning relating to life, or perhaps usually or normally, fits both parts much better.
Okay. So what would the translation be then, using that consistent meaning?
Dubs proposes this alternative. A man's life is usually upright, but if entangled in evil, that man is fortunate to escape calamity.
A man's life is usually upright. Whoa, that's completely different from man is born for uprightness.
Completely different. So what does this mean for our big question?
Well, it means this passage, when you translate it consistently, following the linguistic rules and avoiding Chu's bias, it just stops being about original human nature at all.
Exactly. It ceases altogether to refer to original human nature. It becomes a statement about how life generally goes or how people generally behave during life and the risks of getting involved in bad stuff.
Not a statement about what we are inherently at birth.
Right. It says nothing about original nature without unjustifiable pressing, without twisting the words to fit a preconceived idea, like Chu apparently did. It's an observation on life, not a doctrine of innate goodness.
So the two passages that were supposed to be the explicit proof, neither one actually says Confucius taught human nature is good.
That's Dubs's powerful conclusion. And he goes further. He states, after examining everything, there is no other passage in the Analects or in any other of Confucius's writings that has been suggested as teaching that human nature is originally good.
Wow. No other passages even suggested.
None that have been seriously put forward in the scholarship.
So the final conclusion is,
hence, we may conclude that Confucius did not make any statement about the nature of human nature. He was silent.
Complete silence on one of the biggest debates among his followers. That's kind of stunning.
It really is, especially given how central that debate became.
Okay, so if we connect this finding Confucius's silence to that whole orthodoxy debate, what does it mean?
Well, the immediate implication is huge. It means we cannot therefore decide by this argument that Sun Tzu was unorthodox or that he perverted the teaching of Confucius.
Because Confucius never laid down the rule that Sun Tzu supposedly broke.
Exactly. The whole basis for Chu condemning Sun Tzu on this specific point, claiming he contradicted the master's view on human nature, just dissolves if the master never actually stated that view.
Wow, that pulls the rug out from under centuries of accepted wisdom.
It really does. It doesn't just make us rethink Sinsa, it makes us rethink the whole narrative of early Confucian development.
And there's historical evidence supporting this idea that Sun Tzu wasn't seen as unorthodox early on, right?
Oh, absolutely. And this is maybe even more compelling. Dubs points out that, as a matter of historical fact, Sun Tzu's teachings continued to be regarded as orthodox by the Chinese for more than a millennium.
A millennium. Over 1,000 years.
Yes. Think about that. From the early imperial period, the Qin and Han dynasties onwards, Sun Tzu's ideas, especially his focus on ritual, on education, on social order, were incredibly influential. They helped shape the actual structure of the Chinese state, its laws, its bureaucracy, its education system.
So he wasn't some fringe figure. He was mainstream for a very long time.
Deeply influential. The source even mentions Han Yu, a really important scholar in the 9th century, a kind of precursor to Neo-Confucianism.
Yeah. What did he think?
Even Han Yu, who had some minor criticisms, still generally found Sun Tzu's writings mostly pure with only small flaws. This wasn't someone seen as a heretic.
That long period of acceptance. It makes it really hard to believe Confucius had clearly condemned Sun Tzu's core idea about human nature, doesn't it?
It makes it seem highly unlikely. If Confucius had made a clear statement against that view, you'd expect Sun Tzu to have been rejected much, much sooner by the tradition. That 1,000 years of acceptance strongly suggests Confucius hadn't said anything definitive on the matter.
Which forces us to reconsider Sun Tzu entirely, not as some outsider, like Dr. Creel suggested.
Right. Creel called him an alien thinker, implying he wasn't really part of the core tradition.
But maybe he was actually a loyal follower. Dubs argues he was a loyal follower of Confucius, who saw more clearly than Mencius the true nature of Confucius's teaching.
That's the provocative argument.
How could that be? How could the guy labeled unorthodox centuries later actually understand Confucius better than the celebrated Mencius? That seems paradoxical.
It does seem paradoxical until you look closely at what Confucius actually emphasized day in, day out.
Okay, what were the absolute core, undisputed parts of Confucius's teaching?
Well, number one, the authority of the ancient sages. People like Yao, Shun, Yu. These legendary wise rulers were the ultimate models. Their wisdom, passed down, was the guide.
Okay, look to the past, learn from the best.
Exactly. And Confucius himself became the authority passing on this wisdom. Second, education was stressed as all important. You had to study, learn the classics, the rituals.
Hard work, discipline.
Definitely. Third, man should develop his character on the model of the perfect sage kings. It wasn't about just following your own feelings. It was about emulating these perfected historical examples through rigorous self-cultivation.
So external models, external learning.
Yes. And fourth, unorthodoxy he condemned as harmful. Deviating from the established way, the teachings of the sages was seen as dangerous, leading to social disorder and moral decay.
Okay, so authority, education, emulation of sages, and orthodoxy. That sounds like a system built on structure, learning, discipline, tradition.
Precisely. A system deeply rooted in learning from the past and applying it through disciplined effort. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Think about Mencius's idea again.
That human nature is inherently good.
Right. If man's nature was naturally good, then logically, what need would there be for the education and training so highly emphasized in the Confucian schools?
Huh. Yeah, good point. If you're already good deep down, why all the intense study? Why memorize all the classics? Why practice all the complicated rituals? Why obey the authority of the past sages?
It starts to seem almost redundant, doesn't it, if goodness just naturally unfolds from within?
It kind of undermines the whole practical setup of Confucianism. If everyone is inherently good, maybe you just need to let them be, get out of their way. Follow your heart, maybe.
Exactly. Mencius's teaching, if followed to its logical conclusion, would thus have completely disrupted the Confucian authoritarian dependence upon the past. That reliance on the classics, on the sages, on the whole structure of traditional learning, it becomes less necessary if the answer is already inside you.
It shifts the focus from external authority and tradition to internal intuition, which sounds nice, maybe, but it's not quite what Confucius seemed to be building.
It's arguably quite different from the practical emphasis of Confucius's system. And this is where Sun Tzu comes back in, providing what Dubs sees as a much stronger foundation for that practical system.
How so? Because he said nature tends towards evil.
Precisely because he took that opposite starting point. If you assert, as Sun Tzu did, that Human nature is evil. That is, it tends to evil unless it is properly trained.
Then all that training suddenly becomes absolutely essential.
It becomes the only way to achieve goodness and social order. If our natural inclinations lead to conflict, then rigorous schooling, strict adherence to ritual, disciplined moral effort, guided by tradition, they aren't just helpful options, they are logically necessary.
It provides the reason for the entire Confucian educational and social structure. It makes it make sense.
Absolutely. If so, schooling is absolutely essential, and the Confucian schools became the most important institutions in the country. Sun's view gives the philosophical justification, the why, for the intense Confucian focus on education, ritual, and learning from the past. It makes a whole system indispensable.
But we need to be careful about that word evil.
Yeah.
Right? You mentioned it wasn't like, say, original sin.
Critically important clarification. Dubs emphasizes that Sinsa does not, however, mean by the evil of human nature that it is vicious, nor did he show any Augustinian contempt of human nature.
So not inherently corrupt or damned, more like unshaped, prone to selfishness if left alone.
Something like that. It's more of a practical assessment of tendencies than a deep moral condemnation. And crucially, Sinsa wasn't pessimistic about our potential, quite the opposite.
Really? Even though he said nature tends to evil?
Yes. He asserted that human nature is infinitely improvable. Infinitely. He believed that through the right training, the Confucian training, the man on the street may become as good as the great sage Yu.
Wow. From tending towards evil to becoming a legendary sage king. That's huge potential.
It's enormous potential. So Dubs concludes this is not contempt, but high confidence in human nature, provided it is properly trained. The evil part is just the starting point, the raw material that needs shaping. The potential for goodness is unlimited, but it requires effort and external guidance.
So evil here means something like unformed or naturally self-interested, and the training is what brings out the potential for goodness or social harmony.
That captures the spirit of it much better than thinking of it as inherent depravity. And this cultivation, Simsa argued, could only be provided by the Confucians through their schools, their texts, their rituals.
So his theory basically provides the perfect philosophical justification for the existence and importance of the Confucian system itself.
That's Dubs' argument. Sinsa's theory of human nature is thus the proper and only secure metaphysical background for the Confucian philosophy and practice. It gives the intellectual bedrock for why you need this rigorous, tradition-based system of moral education.
And it explains why Sinsa himself was, as the source says, a thoroughgoing authoritarian.
Yes. He wasn't an experimentalist encouraging people to find their own way. He believed that because human nature, left alone, tended towards disorder, you needed a strong, authoritative system based on the wisdom of the sages to guide people towards goodness and maintain social harmony. The evil nature necessitated the authoritarian structure for the common good.
Okay. This paints Sinsa in a very different light. Not a destroyer, but maybe a pragmatic developer of Confucius's system.
A pragmatic developer who provided the necessary philosophical underpinnings for the system's actual practice. But history took a turn.
Right. Back to Chu Si and the irony.
Dude, deep irony. Because what's fascinating here is that Chu Si, the guy who condemned Xunzi, actually agreed with him on a very practical level.
How so?
Chu Si also taught very strongly that the human heart tends to evil if it is not trained and held in. He believed rigorous self-cultivation was essential to keep selfish desires in check and align with moral principle.
So, in practice, Chu Si sounded a lot like Sun Tzu, even though he declared Sun Tzu unorthodox.
On the practical necessity of training the heart to overcome wayward tendencies, yes, there's a striking similarity, a real convergence in practice, despite the official doctrinal split over the starting point of nature itself.
So why did Chu Si reject Sun Tzu so strongly then, if he kind of agreed on the practical need for training?
It seems to boil down to a crucial misunderstanding, according to Debs. Chu Si misunderstood Sun Tzu's assertion that human nature is evil to mean that nature, i.e. the universe, is evil.
Ah, he thought Sun Tzu was dissing the whole cosmos, not just human inclinations.
Exactly. He seemed to conflate Sun Tzu talking about human nature with the broader concept of cosmic nature or principle, which for Chu Si was fundamentally good. Condemning cosmic nature would indeed have been deeply unorthodox. So this misunderstanding seems to be the linchpin of the formal rejection.
Wow, a massive historical judgment based on a potential misreading.
It appears that way. And to add another layer of complexity, the source points out who the real philosophical heir to Mencius might have been, not Chu Si, despite Chu Si championing Mencius's good nature idea.
Who then?
Wang Yangming, a later philosopher, 15th, 16th century.
What was his deal?
Wang Yangming really leaned into the mentioned idea of innate goodness. He emphasized developing your own pure heart, your innate knowledge. He kind of rejected authority, meaning the heavy reliance on external classics and Chuxi's interpretations, and focused much more on inner, intuitive, moral understanding.
So he was the one truly following Mencius's path of looking inward for goodness.
Arguably much more so than Chuxi, who maintained a strong emphasis on external study and discipline alongside the mentioned starting point. Wang Yangming was the true follower of Mencius in that sense.
Kirishi didn't pick Wang Yangming as the mainstream, did it?
No. Despite Wang's brilliance and influence, it was Chuxi's synthesis, that blend of mentioned good nature theory, with Sun Tzu's-like practical emphasis on discipline and study, that was accepted in China as continuing the orthodox Confucian tradition.
Why? Why did Chuxi's somewhat contradictory system win out in terms of official orthodoxy?
That's a huge historical question. It probably involves lots of factors. Maybe Chuxi's system was more useful for standardizing education and the civil service exams. Maybe it provided a more comprehensive philosophical system. It raises this fascinating question about why the formal label of orthodoxy sometimes diverges from the practical reality or even the pure philosophical lineage. Sometimes what works for the system wins.
Which brings us back to reassessing Xunzi's place.
Yes, Dubs makes a strong concluding plea. Sun Tzu deserves much more careful study than he has received at the hands of the expositors of Confucius. We need to look at him fresh, without the baggage of Chuxi's judgment.
Because, as we established, Confucius himself was silent.
Exactly. Confucius did not make any statement about the nature of human nature. Consequently, his followers had a right to interpret his views either way. There was no explicit commandment from the master for either Mencius or Sun Tzu to violate on this point.
They were both working within the space Confucius left open.
You could see it that way. But Dubs goes a step further in his assessment. He argues that Mencius, by flattering human nature with inherent goodness,
actually broke with Confucius. How?
Because, as we discussed, he made unnecessary Confucius's dependence for guidance upon the classics and the ancient sages. If you're already good, why the absolute necessity for all that external structure and traditional authority that was so central to Confucius's practical method?
It lessened the need for the Confucian educational system itself.
Arguably, yes, whereas Sun Tzu,
by emphasizing the need for training,
developed more carefully than Mencius the true meaning of Confucius, at least in terms of justifying the actual practice of Confucianism. And Dubs concludes, Sun Tzu consequently had really a greater influence than Mencius in determining the inner nature of the later Confucian development.
Wow. So the guy labeled unorthodox might have actually had a greater influence on the real substance and practice of Confucianism over the centuries, because his philosophy provided the logical why for the whole system.
That's the powerful, provocative conclusion of Dubs' analysis. His framework provided the intellectual necessity for the Confucian way of life, the system of learning, moral guidance, and tradition that shaped China for so long.
So what a journey we've taken today, huh? Started with that basic question, good nature, bad nature, and ended up deep in ancient Chinese texts, 12th century interpretations, 20th century scholarship.
And uncovering this really profound silence at the heart of it all, Confucius's silence on human nature.
Yeah, and seeing how later interpretations, maybe even misinterpretations, got layered on top, creating an orthodoxy that might not perfectly match the founder's own lack of statements.
And how that silence ironically opened the door for these two really different paths. Mencius's more intuitive one and Sun Tzu's more structured, disciplined one, both claiming to follow Confucius.
It just hammers home how much interpretation matters, doesn't it? Translation, historical context, who gets to decide what's orthodox, it shapes everything that comes after.
Absolutely. Even a silence, as we saw, can be incredibly powerful in shaping a tradition. And Sun Tzu, despite the label he got later, emerges as maybe providing that crucial philosophical backbone for the practical side of Confucianism, the emphasis on learning, ritual, effort.
Yeah, the stuff that actually built the institutions.
Which leaves us with a really interesting question for you, the listener, to chew on.
What that?
Well, how might our understanding of other foundational texts, other ancient philosophies, maybe religious scriptures, writings of historical figures, how might that change if we really tried to strip away the centuries of interpretation, if we went back to the original words looking for what's actually there, and maybe just as importantly, what isn't?
What other crucial silences might be out there? Silences that shaped history in ways we don't even realize because we're so used to the later interpretations.
Exactly. It pushes us to question the foundations of what we think we know about the past, and maybe even about ourselves.
That is a great thought to end on. Keep that curiosity fired up. Keep asking questions. Keep digging. That's what the deep dive is all about. Until next time, everyone, stay curious.